With like the theme of this panel, I assume that what was kind of meant by the idea of like what in the 70s kind of for the climate where you want to kill Gwen Stacy, who was this, at the time anyway, symbol of like innocence and life, whatever. I'm curious kind of what the impetus behind that was, because, you know, up to that point, you know, if stuff was dark in the world, comics were, you know, presenting an alternative to that. I mean, Captain America was like the positive side of World War II, if such thing is possible. So what made you guys want to, I don't know, if not embrace, then, you know, just kind of showcase that, you know, things are getting darker.
Right. Well, I think, speaking for myself, you know, at that time I started writing comics when I was 16. Ooh, now we go.
There we go.
Thank you very much. All right, so now I have to hold it lower. I started writing comics when I was 16, and that was around 1968 or so. So I came of age during a period of cultural upheaval. You know, a lot of protests, a lot of anti-establishment thinking, and so on. And the 70s were an era where that sort of all congealed and became kind of rancid, you know, where whatever feelings of hope we had had in the 60s for change, we were sort of being confronted by like institutional realities that change was not going to be easy, and it was going to be dark, it was going to be hard. Those of us who were starting our careers in comics as writers and artists, we wanted to express what we were experiencing and feeling at that time. So while comics prior to that were sort of reflecting the experiences and the issues of the prior generation, which was a generation that had sort of fought in World War II and things had turned out pretty well for them and the world was great. My generation was looking at a darker reality, and we wanted to express that. You know, I was 18 in 1971, and my generation was being drafted to go off to Vietnam, and we were not happy about that. 1970 was, you know, the Kent State riots and shootings. We had, you know, civil rights riots. We had the deaths of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. It was not a happy time. Now, to the extent that comics was trying to reflect that, the question becomes, do you want to reflect it and present an optimistic view of life that's out of touch with reality, or do you want to sort of reflect the reality, but in a way that isn't totally hopeless, you know, I mean, not bleak and let's all kill ourselves now, you know, but still reflects the reality. And I thought that the Gwen Stacy story was at least my attempt to sort of comment on the fact that the heroic model that we were operating under, which was the hero always saves the day, nothing bad will ever happen to you, you know, if there's a superhero in the world. And say that no, bad things happen, even with a superhero in the world. And sometimes the hero's efforts contribute to that. That was, I think, a little more realistic approach, but there's still not a hopeless approach, because at the end of that two-part story, you know, there is another door opening for Peter in life. You know, that the path that he was on is gone, but there's another path potentially. So it's both dark and hopeful at the same time. At least that was my goal.
Well, considering that the Gwen Stacy storyline came out of that time period, what are your feelings about the current movies with the Gwen Stacy, knowing they're going to try to tell that story, but it's a completely different world?
Yeah, it's difficult because one of the other aspects of between the movies and the comics is that the comics are a serial storytelling medium where you're going month to month to month, and you're building stories over a period of time, and a familiarity of those characters, you know, develops over time. And a movie is one story, so it's harder to get that same sense of development in one story or even two movies. Probably a better venue for that sort of storytelling is television, you know, because you can do a dramatic arc over a period of a year that can then both create the dramatic event and deal with the consequences. I think if I have any criticism of the film treatment of Gwen's death, it's that we don't have time to process, the consequences in Peter's life. It happens, he feels bad about it, and he's back to Spider-Man. That to me is probably not the best way to tell that story. You should process the grieving and show how it affects him and what his alternatives are and so on. You don't really have that opportunity in a 2-hour movie, which is unfortunate. But I thought, given all of that, the manner in which they depict it and how they set it up is in some ways a lot better than the way I managed to do it in the comic. In the comic, Gwen is a total damsel in distress and a victim. In the movie, she is a equal partner and participant in the decision to get involved. So I think that's a much more effective and better dramatic choice than I was able to use in 1973.
How does it feel to kind of see that element of your story translated into this other medium?
It was kind of chilling. I was fortunate enough to be at the premiere for it, and since the premiere represented a cross-section of people in the industry, it's not average folks, but people in the industry, there was a large percentage of people who did not know that was coming. So I'm sitting there, and she, spoiler alert, she falls in, he catches her, and you hear this snap, and there was at least 20 or 30 people in the audience that go, "Oh my God, no!" And a chill went down my spine, and I got to experience what that must have been like for someone reading the comic in 1973, and it was very dramatic. It was very moving and emotional for me as a creator to see it.
So you're overall pleased?
Well, I was pleased with the particular telling of that sequence of events. Yeah, I thought they did a very good job.
I'm going to ask a question, and I feel like you probably won't answer it. Did Goblin kill Stacy, or did Peter kill Stacy?
Well, she wouldn't have died if he hadn't thrown her off the bridge. And literally nothing Peter could have done could have saved her. That being said, it's obvious that the webbing, contributed to her death. But I think she would have been dead if he hadn't been there.
The way it's written, it's so open to interpretation, and it left.
Well, it's open to interpretation because Peter is told, and Spider-Man is told by the Goblin, the fall would have killed her, which is, yes, fall would have killed her. But the actual immediate cause of death, if you want to say it, is the fact that her neck snapped when the webbing caught her by the foot, which, by the way, was not how we originally envisioned it in the plotting, but when Gil did the pencils of the sequence, it became obvious, looking at the artwork, that her neck snapped. So I added the sound effect, which is where a lot of this comes from. But I think it's one of those serendipitous moments that, while it wasn't intended at the time, makes perfect thematic sense for the story and for the arc of comic book history, as it sort of pivoted on that moment.
It's just great. You changed the character completely from that point forward.
Well, it also, I think it changed, and this is, again, not intentional, so I can't take any credit for it. It's that sort of gave you the moment where comic books kind of grew up, in that, as I say, before that, the hero always saves the day. So there's literally no suspense. You know that if Superman is in the building or on the planet, he is going to save the day. And ditto with Spider-Man. You can say, well, he didn't save Captain Stacy, but he wasn't there. If he had only been there, well, the reality of life is that sometimes the best efforts that we make aren't good enough, and even for heroes, that's the case. And I think that was always inherent in the Marvel universe. That was part of Stan's initial conception, that these are real people who just happen to have powers, so it doesn't take away the potential of real life interfering with their heroism. I just sort of took it to the next logical step, and it could have been anybody, in that particular era that would have taken that next step, which is to recognize that even being a hero isn't always good enough. That probably also because at the time in which we were doing it, when the United States was in the middle of the Vietnam War, where we told ourselves we were the good guys, and we were trying, at least partly, to be the good guys, but we were killing people, and bad things were happening, despite our best efforts. Whether you, from a political point of view, whether you agreed or didn't agree with why we were there, we were trying to do something, and certainly the soldiers who were there were trying really hard to do the right thing, and bad things happen.
Hello. I read everything you did in the 70s.
Oh my God. And you're still here.
My question to you is, do you have a favorite artist to work with back in the 70s? And do you have what's your best memories of the Fantastic Four run that you did?
It's interesting because every artist that I've ever collaborated with had strengths and weaknesses that made that particular collaboration special to me or a nightmare. I would say that my favorite, and so I'm not being disingenuous when I say that I love working with most of them. From a storytelling point of view, I think the two favorite artists that I worked with were Ross Andrew and Jose Guisar Lopez. Jose is probably one of the greatest draftsmen that I ever worked with. Ross was probably one of the most collaborative storytellers that I ever worked with. Neither one of them is a superstar, which is boggling to me. But we tend to look at the finish of an artist's work, how pretty the work is, rather than does it tell the story, does it help us understand what's going on, and that's a different set of talents. So that might be my more facile answer at the moment.
Fantastic Four?
I'm sorry?
Did you have any, what were your memories on Fantastic Four?
Oh, well, Fantastic Four was an odd book because it was a book I desperately wanted to write when I was 12 years old. And when I got to write it, I was, I think, 21 or so, and I realized that I didn't really have a lot to say about those group of characters. Partly it's because of the way that they had developed over time, and I also came in when Sue Storm was not part of the group. Thundra had joined. So it wasn't the core group that I had remembered, and kind of the relationships had changed, and it wasn't, I don't think it was my best work at Marvel by any stretch. So.
Comic book historians go back and forth at what broke the Silver Age into the modern age when that shit happened. A lot of them say it was the Death of Gwen Stacy. And a continual criticism of comic books today is that a lot of them are too dark, or too heavy, or too grounded in this dreary, dismal, like grim and grit reality.
Right.
Do you think that's a fair criticism? Do you think that snowballed from that point when Stacy died? Does it need to shift back to the hero always winning?
Well, I don't think it needs to shift back to the hero always winning, but I do think that there's a tendency in any business where sales are important to follow trends. And it wasn't, I mean, it was the Gwen Stacy story sort of opened the door to the idea of a bleak death. I would argue that the Death of Captain Marvel was really the sales turning point on that, because that book did really well. And when a book sells really well like that, and it's specifically tied to a particular kind of story, lesser minds tend to say, well, that worked, let's do that again with something else. And then, of course, they did The Death of Superman, and boy, that really sold. And now you're into a whole cascade of a certain kind of story. It's not that those stories are invalid, it's just that when you start doing a lot of them, it becomes just about following a trend rather than necessarily telling a particular kind of story that you should tell. I think there's been a lot, and certainly in the 90s, it got really grim. And again, it's trend following. And it's come back from that. I think we could argue that, you know, the last 5 years or so, you know, we've seen a much more positive spin on characters. Marvel in particular, you know, is sort of moving in that kind of more uplifting, emotionally supportive direction. I would argue that the Spider-Man Doc Octopus run, you know, really gave us a whole new way to approach that kind of dark material. So that you both get, you know, a kind of a riveting, what new bad thing will happen kind of storyline, but at the same time you pay it off with a really positive, cool reinterpretation of the character. So I wouldn't close the door on any kind of story. You know, I would just say that you know, we have to sort of watch following trends, which I think is true of good or bad.
I felt like I was just getting to know the new girlfriend when they killed her off.
You mean back in the early 70s? Oh, the film, yeah.
And I felt like if it was Mary Jane, I would be more heartfelt. Was that kind of is that a conscious decision of the franchise?
I couldn't tell you.
Mary Jane,
You mean between the first movie, the first set of movies, and the second set of movies, or? I couldn't tell you. I mean, I would be speculating, but my guess would be that since they knew that they wanted to restart the franchise and come up with a new story arc, if you're going to restart the franchise and sort of reboot it, going back to the beginning, Gwen becomes the first girlfriend. Now, if you bring in Gwen, you know that the main thing about Gwen is that she dies. I mean, that is the main thing about Gwen. There's not a lot else. I defy anybody to tell me a lot about Gwen other than the fact she fell off a bridge. So, knowing that, that's kind of where you're going to go. Now, it's kind of typical in movies and franchises these days that they do 3-part stories. They kind of do trilogies, you know, even though they're saying, well, we're going to do 4 Spider-Man. They didn't know that. They knew that they probably would do a trilogy. So therefore, from a structural point of view, unless you want to leave everybody on a real downbeat note by ending your trilogy with the death of Gwen Stacy, you have to make that the midpoint story. So this is me speculating what they're thinking is. You know, if this was something where you're going to expand over, and you know you're going to do 5 to 10 movies, maybe Killer in movie 4, if you're going to do 10 movies, that would probably fit dramatically the arc that she followed. But of course, if that's the case, then you don't introduce her until movie 2, because remember, Gwen didn't really arrive in Peter's life in the first 121 issues that series represents. She didn't arrive until issue 35 or 36. So that was 1/4 of her history in the book. You know, so theoretically, if you're doing 4 movies, she doesn't arrive up until movie 2. Then you have her in movie 2 and 3, then she's gone in movie 4. But they didn't know whether they were going to do that. So.
You talked a lot about the movies. What are your opinions of the other alternative pages back in the Ultimate Comics?
I'm sorry, speak it up.
You talked a lot about the movies. What are your strong opinions on the other interpretations of Spider-Man, like the Ultimate line or some of the TV?
Well, I really like the Ultimate Spider-Man. I really like Miles Morales because I think that sort of brings us back to the Peter Parker that I started reading. You know, when I started reading Spider-Man like with issue 2, so that's how far back I go. So for me, Peter Parker was always the teenager, you know, dealing with adolescent issues. And I kind of lost interest in the character a little bit when he graduated from high school. I felt like this is not my Spider-Man anymore. So in one sense, Miles Morales is closer to Peter Parker for me than Peter Parker, certainly Peter Parker in Amazing Spider-Man is. Is he what, like 30 now? I don't know. It's like, I honestly don't know. So you kind of, if you want to read that original take on Spider-Man as a teenager, kind of, you know, finding his own way and everything, I think the Ultimate line is really where you go from that. So.
How
difficult is it to weave that kind of stuff into continuity, or should all of this be like untold stories of Spider-Man?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Marvel had an advantage in the 60s that they were basically creating a new mythology. So their continuity was fairly light. They didn't have a lot of weight that they had to deal with. When I started writing Spider-Man, I started with issue 118 or something like that. So I really only had like 8-9 years of continuity to deal with. Somebody asked me at my booth, you know, like, what's my favorite character villain that I created during the period? So, well, you know, in the 70s, we didn't have a lot of villains, so we had to create a lot of villains. You know, we didn't have a backlog of villains. So I was making up, you know, a villain every other month, you know, for my stuff. And so the continuity is fairly malleable and still ongoing. The problem is now 40 years later, there's 40 years worth of stuff. That's hard to deal with. And I don't really know how the companies really can address that, because either you acknowledge it and then you're caught up with just doing the math on, okay, so like if he's fought this character 50 times, but he's only 22. How often did he fight this guy? You know, it's like, you start thinking about the amount of time that stories take in months, days, hours, and you start doing the math on these characters' ages, and it just doesn't add up. So it's really tough. I don't know how you get around the continuity, other than maybe just doing a mind wipe, you know, of the readership every 5 years. You know, I mean, comics used to have an advantage. In the 60s, the theory was that the average comic reader read comics for 3 years, from about the age of 8 till about the age of 11 or 12. And then, you know, they discovered puberty and got other interests. Well, we kind of dealt with that. You know, now everybody keeps reading comics into their 40s and 50s and 60s. And the problem is we remember. You know? And we say, well, wait a minute, that shouldn't happen because you did this. No. Honestly, it's a kind of it's not intended, it was never intended to be one continuous story. It was sort of intended to be a series of stories. And I, as a reader and as a writer now, you know, looking at this stuff, I try to figure out, am I telling a story that happened, didn't happen? And I figure, you know, yeah, it happened, but it's an event. You know, it's an event in this character's life, and maybe it'll have repercussions, you know, if it's valid, and maybe it won't.
You talked about the evolution of the comics industry. Is there anything about where it currently stands that surprises you, that you're concerned about, and where would you like it to be in 10 to 20 years?
Well, I think that one of the things that surprises me is that it's still here. And I say that semi-facetiously, but I can tell you back in the early 70s, we honestly thought that the business had maybe 5 years, because we were just looking at the sales numbers. When I started reading comics in the early 60s, an average issue of Superman sold over 1 million copies a month. And that was regular, you know, and a dad-selling comic book sold 500,000 copies. By the late 1960s, the average sales on Superman were down to about 600,000 copies a month. And the average sale of Spider-Man was 500,000. You know, so he was coming up fast, and DC was anxious about that. But we were still, as an industry, selling hundreds of millions of copies a year. Today, I mean, we just saw that amazing #1, you know, sold a spectacular 8 million copies or something like that, which is pretty amazing. And I don't mean that, you know, as a joke, but it's pretty amazing. But I guarantee that those 8 million copies actually represent about 700,000 sales, because there are 26 variations. And there are got to be a lot of people who went out there and bought all 26 editions, thinking that somehow those will be worth money. They won't. But by all means happen. The big problem in comics today is that the average sale of a well-selling comic book is in these double digits. So, in effect, they don't have a mass audience. the mass audience of comics today are the movies. So the comic books exist now as a kind of development arm for the movie studios. And I don't know that we're ever going to be able to get back to, and I don't know whether we should get back to the way things used to be, but they are definitely smaller.
What are some of like the pros and cons of working with an established character? Like when you come out to a comic, like now they're really established. But like when you're working with them, what are some of the things that are challenges, and what are some of the things that you really like about
Well,
them?
I mean, the first thing is to come up with something new to do with them. Because if you're dealing with like say a character like Superman, there have been so many changes rung on Superman over the years that it's really hard to think of a new approach to that character that stays true to that character. I mean, you can always come up with a new way of dealing with Superman, like have him kill somebody randomly. That doesn't make him Superman anymore, though. I mean, that's just a new way of creating a new character. Spider-Man, similar issues. You know, we kind of know pretty much how he's going to behave in any given situation. So that's both a strong suit and a weak suit. I mean, from a writer's point of view, I know how Spider-Man is going to behave in a given situation. My problem is to come up with a situation that will be of interest, given that we already know how he's going to behave. So I have to come up with a clever approach that puts him, hopefully, in a challenge that we haven't seen before, or haven't seen in this particular way.
All right, just a hypothetical, because I want to know. What if Spider-Man was out to dinner and someone did not tip? And
somebody what?
Would he fill out the rest of the tip if someone else is like, no, I don't tip? You know, if someone said, I'm not going to tip this person, I didn't like them, would Spider-Man actually?
Well, I think Peter Parker would probably throw in an extra buck, you know. You know, and Spider-Man would web the guy to the sea. So, you know.
My ex was married to 2 different women before he came out, like not making him gay or bisexual, and
Okay. We sort of lost the question there, but I understand.
the Green Lantern. Would you comment on that? Weren't they going to make him gay?
Well, I think at one point Kyle was supposed to be gay, wasn't he?
It's the new Alan Scott.
Alan Scott is gay. Yeah, I mean, the new Alan, the new old Green Lantern is gay. Yeah, I mean, in the real world, you know, there should be a percentage. You know, if you have a large group of superheroes, I'm guaranteed, you know, there's going to be a percentage of them who are going to be gay or transgendered or some other percentage, because that's just natural in the normal human universe. So I wouldn't expect it would be different, you know, in the comic book universe. I think our big problem is that, I mean, just speaking for myself, I find it difficult to write convincingly characters from a different ethnic background from me. I mean, I did a horrible job writing Luke Cage back when I wrote that character in the early 70s, and I cringe and embarrassment, you know, and I've had a difficult time writing female characters. My difficulty, and I think the difficulty that some writers might have, you know, writing gay characters, is that we again would we really know? Would it sound right? You know, would we do it right? So there might be like a reluctance on our part, you know, to sort of address it. I think that the younger writers and artists are much better. Well, no, I mean, I just think it's, you know, God, I would think I'd be really dumb at it. But I think that the younger writers and artists who live in an environment where they're more conscious of how people are. It's like, remember, funny story, I just got divorced about 2 years ago, and my wife of 20 years informed me she was a lesbian. Now, how could I have missed that? How could she have missed that? Well, the generation that we were part of, you know, was a generation that, well, but yeah, but what yeah, I mean, I could definitely write, but what I'd be writing about is my cluelessness, which is very, very true, but it's also a generational thing. My generation, my wife would, given where she how she grew up in the environment she grew up in, it was incomprehensible to her that she was gay. I mean, she didn't have... Absolutely. Now I can. But I guarantee you, 2.5 years ago, before this, I would have been clueless. But I can now write about but I can't write about her version of it because I don't know what her version was. But I can try to, be empathetic and understand it, and to the extent that I can address it, maybe I can. But for me, it's a little more difficult just because of where I come from my head. I've spent 25, 30 years trying to liberate my thinking so that I could understand, where I was coming from, that in ways that where I had a set of assumptions that I didn't question, and one of the assumptions was that I was a white liberal male, and that meant that I was progressive and understanding and wise, and all of that. But there's a whole series of assumptions. I mean, we can get into political and social assumptions, but there's a whole series of assumptions that I just never questioned that underlay that. And so, I literally, even with the best of intentions, would write things that were so dunderheaded that I look back at them and go, oh my God, you are clueless. But today's generation of writers, growing up in this world, yeah, I mean, looking at it now, I think I'd like to think I could write more sensitively and more intelligently, and I hope that I will. But I would just argue that the writers who are working today, who have grown up in today's environment, are much better situated at doing it in an intelligent and effortless way than I would be. I mean, Young Avengers is a great example of that. That's a book where you've got a gay lead character, and his relationship is completely effortless. I mean, there's nothing about it that makes us aware of it as anything other than just another relationship. It's exactly how it should be. It should be another interesting complication in life, and that's fine. But I know that if I was thinking about it, it would be in my forefront of my mind rather than in the background of my mind, which is where it should be. As a writer, when you're writing something, the best writing comes when you're just letting stuff out that's contextual to the material, and the complications follow naturally, and you're not thinking too hard about it. Because if you're thinking about it, then suddenly now you're putting a little more emphasis on it than you should be, and it's drawing attention to itself, and it's waving a little flag and saying, look, I'm cool, or I know what I'm talking about, or I'm being sensitive, or any of those things which are kind of patronizing and dumb. Much better if you're aware of that tendency and just try not to get yourself into trouble too badly by making that assumption that you know what you're talking about. Generationally, the people who are 20, 30, even 40 years old today have grown up in a different world than I grew up in, and they didn't argue with their dads about whether. I mean, if I told you, I grew up in Archie Bunker's house. Okay, I was meathead, so the arguments that I had forefronted these issues for me in a way that when I present them, inevitably I present them from that point of view. My 18-year-old daughter grew up in a world in which none of this is an issue. None of it is an issue. She has a completely multicultural background. Her friends range from gay to just all over, And for her, it's incomprehensible to her to have this even be a question. So she just follows what she follows, And it's just like, oh yeah, that's that, and that's this, and that's exactly how it should be, Todd McFarlane got in a lot of trouble at a speaking engagement that we were at. Said it clumsily, but his heart was in the right place, and I want to paraphrase it for him. He was saying that he doesn't want to do stories where the issue is about some social problem. He says it should never be that. It should be something that's inside the material. I'm paraphrasing it to sort of make it work and sound better than he made it sound. But what he was intending to say was that it should be just part of the material. It should just be there, you know, because that's the world we live in.
Spider-Man happens to be gay.
Happens to be gay. Or one of the villains that he fights happens to be gay. And it's not a big deal. It's not why he's a villain. It's not part of his power. It's just... Believe me, there would I swear to God, this is really offensive, and I apologize, you know, but there was a guy, before Black Lightning became Black Lightning at DC, I was the editor of that book, and the original writer of it came to me with his idea for the power for this guy. He's a white guy who, under this, like, gets hit by lightning or whatever, and he can turn black at will. Like, are you kidding me? This is your idea? Yeah, didn't you see the movie Black Like Me? It's like, really? And so that's what we have to deal with. And he meant well. I mean, the terrible thing about this is that he thought he was doing something that was going to address the issue. You know, well, if you're addressing the issue, that's part of the problem.
The Justin character before he spoke.
Is it which one?
The Justin character before he spoke. He was a comic artist.
Right.
They tried to say.
Yeah, you can't, when you hit something on the head, you know, I mean, there's a saying on the nose, you know, that bad writing is writing where you hit it on the nose. And I think, unfortunately for my generation, whatever well-intentioned efforts we made were too much on the nose. But, you know, at least it opened the door and created a, you know, space for people to start thinking about things in a less on-the-nose way, and made it more part of the universe.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned multicultural consumption. Because talking to a guy working with he tells about the new military being.
Yeah, just...
And my first question was, she's talking about Roseberry character, so is she black, white? Because guys don't have to be black.
Right.
Michael, so is she black, white? She said, she's in between.
Yeah.
Is she brown?
Well, it's always hold on to yes. The answer is yes. So it's like, you know, she's just cool.
I have a follow-up question.
But let this guy. Yeah.
So with all the developments you've had in your life at this point, you know, a lot has changed, a lot of growing since you were writing comics regularly with Spider-Man originally. Is there anything you really want to see your team in today? Like any property that's out there that you want to get a hold of?
Well, there's a variety of things, but I mean, I am doing a new Spider-Man miniseries for Marvel, so that's kind of cool. And the story that I'm going to be telling in it is one that I don't know if it's actually been done before. I don't think it's been done to the degree that I'm intending to do it. So
You said that Peter Parker is different now from the one you read. So what is it like going to write that character?
I haven't written the issues yet, so I can't tell you. But my feeling is that he's more mature, you know, so he's less likely to do impulsive, foolish things. And one of the things that I like in characters are characters that do impulsive, foolish things, you know. I mean, that's why I created Firestorm, you know, by definition, you know, it's like the answered the question for me of, you know, like, what if Flash Thompson had gotten Spider-Man's powers? You know, the dumb jock, you know, and then of course they ended up giving him spider-type powers. But the goal was to have fun with a character, you know, that could do silly stuff, and we see the consequences, and it would be fun. But Peter Parker today, I don't think would be impulsive, so that's going to be done.
Do you start to see, going back to the film aspect for a minute, and you were talking about how a lot of it is maybe a template for movies, do you get, or do you see some kind of surge by writers to get together and maybe get like screen credit as far as, you know, writers, original ideas, that kind of thing?
That's a difficult situation, because many of part of when you write a story for comics, you're giving up your rights for those characters, for those stories and those characters. Marvel films, the ones produced by Marvel Studios, they generally do try to give credit to the writers and artists who contribute to a particular take on a character that they use. So more power to them. But we don't have any leverage in that regard. You know, I was barely able to get invited to the premiere, you know, only through making, you know, the stink of it on Twitter. So.
Speaking about the films and stuff, how do you personally feel as someone who's like had a hand in writing and development of this film? Like, how do you feel about his characterization, especially in regards to like the new Amazing Spider-Man? Like, I'm not, you know, but like, how
Do you mean the characterization of Peter Parker as a character? Or?
No, Green Goblin.
Oh, Green Goblin. Oh, well, I didn't create Green Goblin, so I was following along. And Harry Osborn, I did have, you know, some influence over his development, but the really crucial storyline for him was, you know, him taking drugs and how that affected his mind. Which was based on personal experience. You know, so I didn't turn into a Green Goblin. It didn't affect my mind. So there is a sense, you know, that I'm just a witness, you know, to this stuff, you know, and enjoying it. I think actually that they did a pretty good job with Peter Parker's characterization, with Gwen Stacy's characterization. Although I think she's much more like MJ from the comics than she was like Gwen Stacy from the comics. And Harry Osborn, unfortunately, is kind of underdeveloped in the film. I don't think we really know what's driving him other than panic. So. Yeah. Well, you know, that's another take. It's like.
Just in general, like as a writer, like, do you have any particular like do you write longhand? Do you just use a word processor on your computer? You know, is there something you have that you feel gets you like in the zone for writing? And quasi follow up. Tell me more about these drugs that are used.
The 70s. Well, in terms of writing, I find that breaking a story down, I do it best in longhand in notes to myself, and that's the broad strokes. Because I otherwise my mind races on too fast, you know, and I'm jumping too far ahead, putting in more details than I need to. If I'm writing quick notes to myself, I tend to think in broader strokes, which is better for story, developing a story. When I'm actually writing a script, I use a word processor. You know, I've actually written a couple of scripts on my iPad, so that was fun, kind of. But I find that you know, the actual technical means is less important than you know, what's going on in my head. Which leads to the second question, which was I actually did do you know, some psychedelic drugs in the early 70s when I was 18 years old, which I do not recommend kids do not do this, because it has a long-term effect. It actually does. So, you know, I don't recommend it, and it was very interesting. But it was the 70s.
We got to go back to the death thing. Gwen Stacy dies in 121. Green Goblin dies in 122. In a sense, come back, and Superman and a lot of the other examples you mentioned have come back. Do you feel, and maybe pride is too strong of a word, do you feel any pride in what you did with Gwen Stacy to the point that she can't come back?
Well, there was a real moment in time where we were under tremendous pressure to actually bring her back. Those of you who don't know this, I mean, her death did have a kind of an impact on fandom at the time. There was a lot of hostility towards Marvel both for the fact that she died and the fact that you know, how she died. So what? An impact on fandom about how she died and the fact that she died. And Stan, who really just wants to be liked and wants everybody to have a good time, was at a couple of college speaking tours and got a great deal of angry questions, you know, about Gwen, and really felt put on the spot and said, "Oh, I didn't know that she was dead," you know, and silly stuff like that. And he came back and he said, "Listen, I want you to bring her back." And we said, "No, we can't bring her back. You know, if we bring her back, it undermines the story. It weakens the character. It's a terrible idea." And he says, "I don't care. you know, find a way to bring her back. And I said, well, listen, if we bring her back, can I get rid of her again? He said, fine, just make her live, you know. And that led to the clone story. And the clone story was intended to be so final, you know, about whether it was possible to bring back Gwen Stacy and what would that mean, that nobody would ever bring her back again. And that's what it accomplished. Now, there have been, at various times I've heard, there have been efforts to try to unwind that. I mean, at one point when they were doing, you know, Another Day, they were saying, well, maybe we'll just rewind it all the way back to high school, you know, and, you know, she's still alive. But saner heads prevailed, and they realized, no, this is a kind of iconic thing. This would be like, why not bring back Uncle Ben? You know, it's like, while we're at it, you know, let's keep Superman on Krypton. You know, it's like, there are certain things that are kind of become part of the myth. And even though this took place 10 years, you know, into the run, it's now so deeply embedded in the history of the character, I think you couldn't really change it.
What about Joe Straczynski's run and what he did with Gwen Stacy?
Those are what we call imaginary stories. That's my answer.
How happy were you when you started to write Spider-Man that he had such a large supporting cast? I mean, it was everybody from the college, the work situation, sons, daughters, that kind of thing.
Well, it's a tremendous benefit to a writer to have a lot of characters to bounce off of each other. I mean, you get a lot of story ideas, you get a lot of interplay. It's one of the things that makes Spider-Man such a great character is his supporting cast of characters. You know, there are other. I mean, Fantastic Four, as an alternative example, has a very limited set of supporting characters, and as a result, you're sort of reduced to sort of circling around the same dynamics over and over and over again. With Spider-Man, you could always bring in Joe Roberts in the storyline, or you could bring in Betty Brant, find out what happened to Liz Allen. You know, I mean, we had a lot of options, so it was really good. Let's take him first.
You know, kind of getting in a broad sense, what you started off with like, you know, darkness, but with a touch of, like, you were talking about, you know, the sales figures for comics and how, you know, a lot of the big studios are almost like developing for film now. At the same time, do you see perhaps, even as superheroes as a genre are becoming this kind of nebulous stage rock thing, comics, the medium, are, you know, needing to expand their content, and that might, because I mean, this con itself, I see a lot less superhero stuff than you made 5-6 years ago, when, you know, people got their baseball comics, their all this stuff.
It's really true. Yeah, one of the misnomers, and I think it's a shorthand that we sort of use, because for the 60s and 70s, and to a lesser degree the 50s, superheroes were comics. You know, but comics is actually a form, and superheroes is a genre within comics. And there are actually a number of movies that are, you know, and TV shows that are being spawned by non-traditional superhero comic books. You know, we've got Constantine is going to be a TV series. We've got iZombie is going to be a TV series, and so on. So I mean, it's not just we tend to think of the superheroes as representative of comics. And when I try to tell people who talk to me about comics, and they say, "Oh yeah, those guys with the leotards," you know, and they're like, well, that's actually, you know, that's a genre within a much wider spectrum of material. It's a format. I mean, it's a way of telling stories. And actually, many of my favorite comics today are not superhero comics.
Could you name some of those?
I like Erin Faith Hill's material. She does some terrific graphic novels about young women. That's kind of cool stuff. I actually like a lot of web comics. I'm a big fan of, I can't remember the name of it. Dark Science. That's, yeah. Atomic Robo is my favorite comic book right now. Bar none. Yeah, I love Atomic Robo. So those are not, you know, superheroes. Rocketeer, you know, is great stuff. I mean, they are kind of adventure comics, you know, so I clearly lean in that direction. Some of the stuff that I wrote that I was proudest of were not superhero comics. I wrote Scout Hunter, which was a Western, and I had a lot of fun with that.
The controversies that are going on right now in comics, diversity, representation, sexism, harassment, creators and store owners, internet rage. Do you think ultimately it's going to help comics, or do you think that kind of stuff is going to hurt comics?
In a weird, I think it's birth pangs. I think that what we're seeing, and to be on a political level too. One of the most fascinating things in recent years in politics is how, as the country has sort of moved more to a more progressive feeling generally, I'm not saying on a governmental level, but progressive in social issues, the further right has gotten louder and louder and louder and angrier and angrier and angrier because they feel their hold on power loosening. And I think that the kind of rage that we're hearing from entrenched male fans and store owners or whoever is they're feeling their power being torn away from them. The fact is that comics are becoming more and more representational every year, that's to the benefit of the industry, it's the benefit of the fans, it's the benefit, of it creatively. There are going to be people who resent that, and they're going to be angry, and they're going to be verbal about it, and really obnoxious about it. And in fact, the more you hear that, the more you know that change is happening. Because if it wasn't happening, they have nothing to be upset about.
So a lot of characters have come out of your pen. You've written a lot of very famous characters. And you're very famous in the industry. You've been in it for a long time. Personal or business, what is the worst part about working for one of the major two companies?
Well,
friends, family, co-workers?
The beauty of my situation is that I haven't worked for either of them full-time for 20 years. So most of the people that I work with, are either out of the business now or dead. So there's that. But I think both companies have their problems, which is that they are both corporate entities that are not really, their bottom line is that they're about the bottom line. And that's okay. I mean, to the extent that they let creators have a certain amount of leeway and they encourage it for their own benefits. I mean, it's to their benefit to encourage it. Then we all, benefit from that. But ultimately, you're there to serve their needs if you're a creator. And that's hard, to reconcile. When I started in comics, I was a kid, and all I wanted to do was do comics. And I was willing to do whatever it took to do that, because it was just a tremendous opportunity, and it was joyful, and I was happy to do it. I wrote the first Punisher story for $300, and that's all I've ever seen from the Punisher. And that's fine, because I knew that that's what I was doing. Of course, I also thought that this was going to end in about 5 years, so it didn't really matter. But, we didn't know back then. Today, you know. So a lot of creators make choices based on that knowledge that affect what types of comics you see. You may have noticed that neither Marvel nor DC has initiated a really spectacularly new superhero in about 20 years. They never will, because no creator is ever going to create another major superhero for Marvel or DC. Why would they? Under the best of circumstances, you get 10% of the value of whatever that character creates. That's under the best of circumstances. So it's not going to happen. But the upside of that is that independent creators, independent publishers are doing more and more interesting stuff, that I think is broadening the field. Remember, Disney, until the last decade or so, was recycling Mickey Mouse cartoons, and Frozen is spectacular because, oh my gosh, it's a whole new thing. Well, it is and it isn't, but it's new for them, and they had to change a lot of their business practices in order to get talented people to work for them to create something new. So maybe something like that will happen for the comics.
And on non-business side, like you said, you have an 18-year-old daughter. I probably speak for a lot of people in the room. Let's say we were in front of your daughters. Does she have any comic book friends that just geek out? Like, oh my God!
Yeah, she does. Here's the real sad irony of having an 18-year-old daughter. Until this year, when she took a class on graphic novels in her high school, she had never read a comic book. She had no interest. I couldn't get her to look at my stuff. Her friends were impressed. She had a handful of friends who were geeks, and they were like, "Oh my God, your dad's wrote Spider-Man." But for her, I was just dad, and whatever dad did was annoying. So, she didn't care. But now she's a big fan. And not of my stuff yet. She still hasn't read anything by me, so that was good. But she's a big fan of some very talented people that I'm proud to call my friends, and other people who I'd like to have as friends. So good for her. We went to the premiere together, and at the end of it, she knew it was coming. So at the end of it, after Gwen Stacy dies and everything and all this stuff, she turns to me and says, "Dad, you suck." It's a proud moment.
Audience, my next question. On a different note, perhaps related to the game I think it's very interesting to me that you seem to me feel like the vibe I get from you that you seem to, I don't know if it's true or not, you seem more like an artist or creative, which I feel I am. But the audience, people here seem more like nerds, geeks, I don't know.
Well, I think we're all artistic in one sense or another. I mean, in that we all have a desire to embrace creativity.
Well, I think everyone's creative, not everyone's artist.
Yeah.
Some people are artists.
Yeah.
They're artistic field. I think it's interesting that, I don't know, if you consider yourself as a nerd or a geek.
Well, I'm a geek nerd artist. And I think those are all comparable things. I think that geekdom, is a desire to reshape the world to fit your internal vision of how that world should be, which is I think a good thing, which is another way to define artistic. There's a lot of people who create through body art, through their own personal body art. There's people who dress up as cosplay. That's a form of artistic expression. There are people who draw their own comics, write their own comics. I mean, being a geek, in my view, is a way of interpreting the world and your place in it. And it requires like a heightened awareness of culture. Most people sort of wander through life, and just sort of get bombarded passively by culture. They don't know what it is that they're experiencing, or they're seeing the latest movie or whatever. Geeks are actively engaged. They either want to seek out a particular cultural experience, or they want to change it. They want to shape the world to their ends. That's an artistic lifestyle. So.
Yeah, that's a little more accurate to me, because I researched the definition after this new nerd thing. It's called Nerd Night. That West Side started in New York. And I thought, there should be a geek.
Yeah.
So I researched the definition. I think the Urban Dictionary defines geek. Someone who's geek is more slang.
Yeah. I think it's all very, it's labels, but it's labels. I think it fits wherever you want it to fit. And speaking of which, this has sort of fit my time frame that I'm allowed here. So. Yeah.